Welcome to Sacred and Skeptical. This is a space for people who still feel drawn to the sacred, but can no longer pretend certainty where there isn't any. It's for those who want depth without dogma, meaning without manipulation, spiritual language that can withstand honest questions. I started Sacred and Skeptical because I kept meeting thoughtful, sincere people who felt spiritually homeless, too reflective for rigid belief systems, but too intuitively aware to settle for cynicism. Here, we explore ideas slowly. We examine what's widely known, what's debated, and what remains unresolved. We make room for both research and lived experience, not to argue, not to convince, but to think clearly and feel honestly. If you're spiritually curious but cautious, intellectually serious but still searching, you're in the right place. Let's begin. What if? Questioning is not a failure of faith, but a maturation of it. A Sacred and Skeptical essay by Jennifer Irene Stewart. I sat on my deck early this morning, watching the way light moved through the leaves in my garden. There is something about morning light that feels honest. It doesn't rush. It doesn't argue. It simply reveals what is already there, shadow and brightness in the same frame. As I watched the wind move through the branches, a memory surfaced. Me at 35, notebook open, pen moving quickly, frantically copying down every word from a spiritual teacher I admired, afraid I might miss the one insight that would finally fix me. The contrast between that woman and the one sitting quietly in her garden this morning felt almost poetic. Back then, spirituality felt urgent, high stakes. If I could just understand enough, practice enough, believe correctly enough, perhaps I could outrun the ache in my nervous system. Perhaps I could transcend the parts of myself that still trembled from old wounds. Now, years later, my spirituality feels quieter. Less like a performance, less like a quest for the right answers, more like a conversation. And somewhere along the way, a question emerged that changed everything. What if questioning is not a failure of faith, but a maturation of it? What if you can be deeply spiritual without believing everything you're told? The weight of spiritual expectation. Many of us come to spirituality already carrying something. Sometimes it is grief, sometimes it is trauma, sometimes it is the quiet dissatisfaction of success that didn't satisfy. And often, it is disillusionment with organized religion, or with rigid belief systems handed to us in childhood. Research in the psychology of religion consistently shows that people rarely leave faith traditions because they stop caring about meaning. They leave because they crave coherence, because something inside them can no longer reconcile lived experience with doctrine. So we go searching. And in that searching, many of us find alternative spiritual spaces that feel liberating at first. Less dogma, more openness, more emphasis on personal experience. But here is the subtle pattern I began to notice in myself. I hadn't stopped craving certainty, I had simply relocated it. Instead of memorizing catechisms, I was memorizing manifestation formulas. Instead of fearing divine judgment, I feared low vibration. Instead of confessing sin, I was confessing blocks. The language changed, the urgency remained. Psychologists describe this pattern as certainty seeking under distress. When the nervous system has experienced instability, especially chronic instability, it looks for frameworks that promise predictability and control. This is not weakness, it is biology. The human brain is a pattern-detecting machine. Under stress, it prefers clean narratives over complexity. Research in cognitive science shows that ambiguity activates threat circuits in the brain. Certainty, even rigid certainty, calms us. So it is no surprise that when we are wounded, we are vulnerable to teachings that promise resolution. I was no exception. The workshop. I remember the workshop vividly. It was expensive. Beautiful venue, soft lighting, calming music. The teacher spoke with practiced gentleness. The room was full of intelligent, sincere people who wanted to heal. At one point, I described my ongoing trauma responses. Hypervigilance, waves of grief that felt disproportionate to the present moment, a body that seemed unable to fully relax. The teacher looked at me with compassion and said something like, "These are just stuck energies. Once you raise your vibration and release resistance, they will dissolve." The room nodded, and for a moment, I wanted that to be true. But something in my body went still, not in agreement, in protest. My nervous system, which had spent decades adapting to real danger, was being reframed as spiritually misaligned. If only I meditated correctly. If only I practiced gratitude deeply enough. If only I believed strongly enough. Then the symptoms would disappear. On the surface, this teaching sounded empowering. It suggested agency. But underneath it, I felt a familiar undertone. Shame. Because if my trauma persisted, it must mean I was doing spirituality incorrectly. What trauma research actually shows. Here is what decades of neuroscience and trauma research tell us. Trauma is not simply a negative belief pattern. It is physiological. Researchers like Bessel van der Kolk and many others in the field of trauma science have documented how trauma reorganizes the nervous system. The amygdala becomes more reactive. The stress response becomes sensitized. The body holds implicit memories that are not accessible through rational thought alone. Hypervigilance is not a mindset flaw. It is a survival adaptation. When a body has learned that the world is unsafe, it does not release that learning because someone reframes it as illusion. The nervous system requires safety, co-regulation, repetition, and time. There is nothing spiritually deficient about that. In fact, many trauma-informed therapists describe these responses as intelligent adaptations. The body did what it needed to do to survive. To label those adaptations as low vibration is to misunderstand both trauma and the body's wisdom. And yet, here is where nuance matters. Many spiritual traditions do emphasize the power of perception, of attention, of consciousness. There is evidence that meditation changes neural pathways. There is evidence that gratitude practices alter mood states and even immune markers. But these are supportive tools, not magical erasers. The problem was not that the workshop offered meditation. The problem was the absolutism, the suggestion that suffering is simple, that complexity is illusion, that if healing does not occur, it is a failure of belief. Something in me rebelled, not against spirituality, against reductionism, spiritual bypassing, and the seduction of simplicity. Psychologist John Wellwood coined the term spiritual bypassing to describe the use of spiritual ideas to avoid psychological work. It is a gentle phrase, but it names something many of us have experienced. When grief is reframed as attachment, when anger is reframed as ego, when trauma is reframed as karma, when injustice is reframed as soul contracts. Each of these ideas may hold metaphorical or philosophical depth in certain contexts, but when applied indiscriminately, they can become tools of avoidance, and sometimes tools of shame. Human experience is layered. Psychological research consistently shows that healing requires integration, not transcendence alone. Integration means the body, the emotions, the story, the meaning-making, all brought into conversation, not bypassed. It took me years to realize that my discomfort at that workshop was not resistance to healing. It was discernment, the permission to question. There is a developmental shift that often happens in midlife. Researchers in adult development, people like Robert Kegan, describe stages of meaning-making. Early stages depend heavily on external authority. Later stages involve internal authorship. In simpler terms, we begin by inheriting beliefs. Over time, we either remain in them unquestioned, or we begin to evaluate them. Questioning does not mean cynicism. It means maturation. I began to notice teachings that did not fully land in my body, that everything happens for a reason, that we choose all our experiences before birth, that positive thinking alone can heal trauma, that specific practices guarantee specific outcomes. Each of these ideas can offer comfort, and for some people, they resonate deeply. But treating them as universally binding truths felt constricting. Life, as I had lived it, was more complicated. And here is something quietly radical. It is possible for an idea to be meaningful without being literal. It is possible for a metaphor to inspire without becoming doctrine. It is possible to appreciate a practice without absolutizing it. The sacred art of not knowing. Perhaps the most spiritual stance we can take is one of humble uncertainty, not nihilism, not apathy, but spaciousness. Philosophers have long pointed out that intellectual humility correlates with psychological flexibility. Research in social psychology suggests that people who hold beliefs lightly are better able to update them in light of new evidence. And interestingly, contemplative traditions across cultures emphasize something similar. In Zen Buddhism, there is the concept of beginner's mind. In Christian mysticism, there is the cloud of unknowing. In Jewish tradition, wrestling with God is not rebellion, it is engagement. Across traditions, doubt is not always the enemy. Sometimes it is the doorway. When I stopped trying to eliminate uncertainty, something softened. My meditation practice remained because it grounded me. Energy work remained because it helped me feel into subtle experience even while acknowledging its mysteries. Study remained because I love learning. Time in nature remained because it steadies my nervous system more reliably than almost anything else. But none of these practices came with guarantees. They became tools for exploration, not badges of spiritual performance, beyond spiritual perfectionism. There is a particular kind of perfectionism that hides in spiritual spaces. It whispers, "You should be more evolved by now. You should not still feel triggered. You should have transcended this." Perfectionism, psychologists tell us, is often a strategy to avoid shame. If we can perfect ourselves, we cannot be rejected. When spiritual growth becomes another arena for perfectionism, we recreate the very pressure we sought to escape. Midlife offers a strange gift. By then, most of us have failed at enough things to know we cannot control everything. We have loved and lost. We have tried to optimize ourselves. We have seen plans dissolve. Certainty loosens its grip. And in that loosening, discernment becomes possible. Discernment is not about rejecting everything. It is about listening carefully. How does this teaching land in my body? Does it expand me or constrict me? Does it generate compassion or shame? Does it align with well-established knowledge about human psychology and biology? Discernment requires both intuition and evidence. It is neither blind faith nor reactive skepticism. It is relationship. The freedom in holding belief lightly. When I released the pressure to believe everything, my spirituality did not collapse. It deepened. Because now it is rooted in lived experience, informed by research, open to mystery, and willing to revise. There is freedom in allowing paradox. Healing can require both acceptance and effort. Spirituality can honor both transcendence and therapy. Growth can mean adding practices and subtracting illusions. Wisdom can contain both knowing and not knowing. This is not relativism. It is complexity. Life is rarely either or. It is usually both and. A more mature spirituality. What does mature spirituality look like? It looks less like frantic note-taking, more like quiet presence, less like defending beliefs, more like asking better questions, less like outsourcing authority, more like integrating wisdom. It allows science to inform practice. It allows psychology to illuminate shadow. It allows mystery to remain mystery. It does not require certainty to sustain awe. And perhaps most importantly, it does not shame the nervous system for doing its job. An invitation. If you are in a season of questioning, you are not broken. If teachings you once clung to no longer feel sufficient, that may not be backsliding. It may be growth. If your body resists certain narratives, that resistance might carry intelligence. Spiritual maturity may not mean believing more. It may mean believing more thoughtfully, holding convictions with integrity, and releasing them when experience asks you to. It may mean recognizing that doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is faith that has outgrown fear. So perhaps the question is not, can you be spiritual without believing everything? Perhaps it is, what kind of spirituality emerges when you trust yourself enough to question? What kind of reverence becomes possible when certainty loosens? What if the most sacred act is not agreement, but honest engagement? This morning, as light moved through the leaves, nothing demanded belief from me. The garden did not require explanation. It simply invited presence. And that, these days, feels like enough. In closing, as we close, I want to leave you with this. You don't have to rush toward a conclusion. You don't have to tidy your emotions into something inspirational. You don't have to turn every experience into a lesson before it's ready. It's enough to notice what's true for you. It's enough to sit with it, gently, honestly, and allow it to unfold at its own pace. Sacred and Skeptical exists because many of us are trying to build a spirituality that can hold real life. A spirituality that isn't afraid of questions. A spirituality that doesn't collapse in the presence of grief. A spirituality that respects both research and lived experience. If this reflection gave you language for something you've been sensing, I'm glad. If it stirred questions, even better. You're always welcome to share your thoughts in the comments, not to debate, not to perform certainty, but to explore. Thank you for thinking with me. I'll see you in the next essay.